After one of my talks on Jack the Ripper on a cruise ship journey, a gentleman came from the audience announcing that he was ex-FBI. He did congratulate me on the talk, but said that I was flying very close to the sun. The problem I have is that I can't fully prove all my assertions because a lot of time has gone, 140 years of that order, and many of the trails have been blocked. But I'd like you to consider the story, and if you feel it has real validity, please pass it on. And the final solution is not actually the final video. There is a third. If I cannot convince you that James Kenneth Stephen was Jack the Ripper, then let us have it in his own words, and that will be part 3. So let's continue the story of the true identity of serial killer Jack the Ripper. I'd like to start this second part of the story with a poem by Rudyard Kipling. It has some relevance in that he was a contemporary at the time of Jack the Ripper. I keep 6 honest serving men. They taught me all I knew. Their names are what and why and when, and how and where and who. I send them over land and sea, I send them east and west, but after they have worked for me, I give them all a rest. I intend using what, why, when, how, where and who in my search. Now continuing that poem, and the person in question is in fact Queen Victoria. But different folk have different views. I know a person small. She keeps 10 million serving men who get no rest at all. She sends them abroad on her own affairs from the second she opens her eyes. 1 million hows, 2 million wheres, and 7 million whys. Let us continue our Sherlockian investigations. James had at least 6 safe houses. Now the one in Cambridge and Annaverna, which was in Southern Ireland, are too far away to be of much use when we're considering the killings in Whitechapel area. But his law offices in Temple were only a mile away, probably a brisk 10-15 minute walk. His parents' house in the West End, 3 miles away, but again, as I mentioned earlier, he could catch the London Underground, the Tube, across to the West End of London. Osiers in Chiswick also could be attained by use of the Tube, and Toynbee Hall, which I've said is the real lair of the Ripper, was half a mile away. As it happens, James had a cousin, George Duckworth, and George was employed by Charles Booth to help map the East End of London, to map the areas of poverty and real deprivation. As you can see from this map, the yellow circle is where Toynbee Hall was and still is, and the areas of deprivation, the very dark black areas, were the really deprived areas of Whitechapel and Spitalfields. So Toynbee Hall was nearly at the centre of all of that. And it could be that James accompanied George every now and then, researching, investigating these houses, in which case in broad daylight he could have made observation of the alleys, the snickets, the passageways, and what we call the ginnels between these areas, and that would have given him the intelligence he needed to move from A to B and avoid the police. James had a kind of magnetic pull with Toynbee Hall. Oscar Browning, his disgraced tutor, taught there, as did James's uncle Leslie Stephen. It may even be that James taught there, the idea being to educate the poor in the East End of London. It was opened in ceremony either by Eddie, Albert Victor, or by Edward, the Prince of Wales, which gave James, if you like, a focus of anger. But more importantly, it had accommodation for students, both in dormitories, but also in single rooms where you could have complete privacy. Now here's a sketch of Toynbee Hall, and even though it said it had a gatehouse, it looks from this as though there's no fencing and no proper security to access from the streets for Toynbee Hall. If we look at the last known addresses of these 7 murdered women, or at least the last addresses that they infrequently stayed at, we can see that 6 of the 7 are within less than half a mile of the focal point I've mentioned already, Toynbee Hall. So, Martha Tabram, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly and Alice Mackenzie were all within reach. With a different view of the canonical 5, you have George Yard buildings very, very close to Toynbee Hall and the others around it. The outliers, Bucks Row and Dutfield Yard, certainly were a distance from Toynbee, but frankly a 10-minute walk at the most. Here I've added the black squares for murders number 1 and 7, and again with the loci, the blue ring on Toynbee Hall, you can see that that was basically the centre of Jack's operations. The yellow triangles around are pubs in the area. There were 6 of them, and this really could have been the meeting place of Jack with the unfortunate women. There were well over 200 lodging houses in the East End of London and around that area at the time of Jack the Ripper. A book like this one by Joseph O'Neill, The Secret World of the Victorian Lodging House, gives some idea as to their makeup, their costs, and the type of women and men living in them. If you wanted and could afford some form of privacy, then a double bed in a cubicle would cost you £1, whereas a single one, half that amount, 6p. And you can see from this picture that if you could afford privacy, it was well worth it. Now, women on the street, if they could, would keep back at least 4p so that they could have a coffin for the night. Basically, warmth, heat, and safety. For a penny, you could afford a sit-up in a warm place for the night, and for 2p you could stretch over a rope, hence the expression to be on the ropes when you had no money and nowhere to go. Right at the bottom of this pile is the workhouse, where basically you had to work for a living. You got fed, you had warmth, safety, security, safety of a sort, because there was still crime within these premises, but you had to work to make ends meet. And the kind of work a woman would have to do in order to earn her keep would be this: to shred old rope from ships, which was tarred. It's a hard, painstaking work, hard on the hands. Then there was, of course, a mix of establishments where you had these so-called coffins, where you'd hope to get a night's sleep, but also a lot going on in the background. So it wasn't an easy time when you had to resort to these types of premises. This newspaper picture from the time of the Ripper shows women in the West End who have themselves weapons like guns, canes, knives and heavy bags. But it wasn't really the West End that had the problem. There you had, if you like, a better class of street women, the aristocracy, and brightly lit streets and pavements. But over in the East End, if you had no money at all, sleeping on the street was very common. And particularly the ladies in this predicament were called unfortunates. Exampled by these 4 or 5 ladies who are waiting to get into the workhouse as their final place of rest. So at the end of the day, Jack had a conveyor belt of ladies, unfortunates, on the streets, either asleep, inebriated, or in no way, shape or form corpus menti, waiting for him. At Toynbee Hall, Jack, or James, on the other hand, had a nice cosy bed in his own private room with a washstand and a toilet outside, he could wash his bloody hands. And it was yards away from the centre of the East End of London. James was now mentally crumbling away, but at least he could live out his fantasy of attempting to kill 10 women on the streets of the East End, and his poem of Jerusalem could come alive. We now need to digress a while and talk about James's father, James Fitzjames Stephen, who was a High Court judge, and he judged a number of very high-profile cases, 2 of which we'll talk about. He made errors of judgment, and this impacted on James's mental constitution. Was the graffito found on the wall where Catherine Eddowes' shawl, part of her torn shawl, was found? With the misspelling, perhaps Juwes? What could that have been about? And why did Sir Charles Warren immediately order that it was taken off the wall? Was it something to do with the Freemasons and the fact that he was one? In Freemasonic law, the master builder Hiram Abiff was assassinated by 3 of his fellows, Jubala, Jubalo, Jubalum. And this is a second idea about the Jewes word on that piece of graffito. You can see this well illustrated in the 1960s film Murder by Decree. One witness, Israel Schwartz, who saw an altercation of a man and a woman where the man threw the woman down by her hair onto the street near Dutfield Yard, where that night the 4th victim of the Ripper, Elizabeth Stride, was murdered. And this man who assaulted the woman shouted Lipski at Israel Schwartz. This was a derogatory term at the time because of a murder trial that had happened and a hanging that happened afterwards the year before. Israel Lipski was accused of the murder of Miriam Angel the year before in 1887. It appeared to have been a joint suicide bid, which went wrong, perhaps. Angel had nitric acid in her, and Israel Lipski was tried by James's father, who was very quick to convict him for hanging, and indeed received a lot of negative press and negative public reaction because of that. A second murder trial judged by James's father, James Fitzjames Stephen, occurred in 1889, the year after most of the Ripper murders, and it involved a lady, Florence Maybrick, who was accused of murdering her husband, James Maybrick, a Liverpool cotton merchant. Now, as it happened, this book that came out later, The Diary of Jack the Ripper, was a red herring. It was a forgery. There were a number of anachronisms within the text, and it was found that the ink of the diary simply wouldn't have fitted the time of the 1880s. Now, after this book had come out, which actually named James Maybrick as Jack the Ripper, I did begin to think of the coincidence that at the time there were waxworks in Madame Tussauds of both Florence Maybrick and Jack the Ripper, and indeed at the Lewis Fire Festival on Bonfire Night, November the 5th, often large figures of unpopular people were burnt, criminals and the type, and indeed they had chosen themselves Jack the Ripper and Florence Maybrick. So I did wonder whether whoever wrote the diary, and it was proved that it was written by a local person, had used that combination in his idea. Remarkably, people in Austria, in a place called Styria, used to consume very small amounts of arsenic. Apparently it brightens and lightens the skin and makes your complexion look nice. James actually took arsenic as well in very, very small amounts. And believe it or not, Florence was put on trial for his murder because he seemed to have been poisoned with arsenic. But the reality was he poisoned himself, and Florence was innocent. James Fitzjames Stephen had his own misogynistic views, and he moved very quickly to persuade the jury to convict Florence. So she would have been hung, basically, and hung really for adultery because she had a young lover, and that was very much against the case for James Fitzjames Stephen. She would have been hung for adultery. Instead, this American woman spent 14 years of a 20-year sentence in prison. The reason she wasn't hung, again, was because of the public attitude and the media attitude to this very quick sentencing of a woman with no real evidence. Florence Chandler Maybrick changed her name to simply Florence Chandler and became known as the Catwoman of Gaylordsville because she had many, many cats. She attempted to earn a living by being a prison reformer in the early days, and she lived in South Kent and Gaylordsville, Connecticut, dying in 1941. And so it seemed that a very vehement James Fitzjames Stephen, James's father, was losing the plot, and James with it because of the attitude to his father, who was slowly, or rather quickly, losing ground in legal fraternity. And so we have it that the common denominator in these two trials, or mistrials in a way, August 1887 with Israel Lipsky and August 1889, either side of the 1888 murders of Jack, was his own father, James Fitzjames Stephen. James's father was far too quick to direct the jury to hang people who may have been innocent, and certainly in one case was innocent. And the reality of the case, as history will show, is that James Fitzjames Stephen, James's father, was himself slowly going mad. He was forcibly retired from the law courts and died insane in Ipswich in 1894, 2 years after his son. And we can see here not a distinguished line, but an extinguished line of madness from James Fitzjames on the right, a third of the way down, Leslie Stephen, the uncle, Virginia Woolf herself, who died insane and committed suicide, James Kenneth Stephen, and then the son of one of his brothers, Harry Stephen, James. A line of madness. Now the Stephen coat of arms had the expression sursum on it in Latin, which means upwards. I'm afraid from this point on, at least two of the Stephens were going downwards. Now, conveniently for everybody, James died of so-called starvation in an asylum in Northampton 20 days after he had heard of Eddie's death. And he repeatedly said that he believed police were after him for some crimes. Interesting. So now it's time to don Sherlock Holmes's hat again, his pipe and his magnifying glass, and look in more detail at the means, motives and opportunities that James had to kill these 7 women. And the very first criteria to consider is that of motive. Well, there's many to list. The loss of Eddie to a woman, rejection by women, and there's at least 2 cases of that, possibly 3. His growing hatred of women, which is shown in his own poetry. His illness and legal mistakes of his father. Hatred of royalty because Eddie had been taken away from him. And of course a classic for murder because of sexual reasons, venereal disease. And now began a very fast decline. He was a manic depressive or bipolar, and then had a major severe brain injury at the end of 1886. He couldn't carry on his law business. His magazine business or journal business, the reflector failed. His mental instability was gaining ground. Let's now consider the opportunities that James had to kill. Some of the murders were on weekends, so we could consider his premises in Anaverna in Southern Ireland and indeed his accommodation in Cambridge, but they were probably less likely than his own law office, which was a 10-15 minute walk away, his student accommodation in Toynbee Hall, and Ozier's and his own parental home in the West End of London were a simple subway ride away. If I'm wrong about Toynbee Hall as the lair of the Ripper, then I would choose this place, Temple, between Holborn and Fleet Street. You can see the two rings, one is Whitechapel and the other is James's law business. It's something like 10 to 15 minutes walking. It's actually 5 minutes, 6 stops on the then Underground. Now this is a place of complete privacy for James as well, not far from the scenes of the crimes. James would have been a very nice catch for one of the unfortunates strolling the streets at that time of night. He was young, 28-year-old, good looking, and seemed harmless enough. Certainly not Jack the Ripper. The women, or some of them, may have been incapacitated, inebriated through a drink, or simply sleeping because they were desperate and had nowhere else to go. Now, in the first instance, the first murder of Martha Tabram, he carried and used a sword stick. That was because people thought one of the stabbings through a bone had been caused by a bayonet. And he also carried, perhaps in the first killing, a small penknife, which became a navaja in other killings, a Spanish fighting knife which is foldable and could be easily hidden and kept in his jackboot. And for the means, I've already mentioned the navaja and the sword stick, which will now develop further. It's likely that James carried and used a sword stick only once in his first killing. He was on a learning curve. Obviously a sword stick, carrying it, is very visible, and as the murders progressed, he would not wish to appear too visible. So it was used in one point with Martha Tabram, the first victim, along with a penknife. Now, Jack quietened the women first to make sure they didn't scream out. Then he used, in the first instance, as mentioned, a sword stick, and then the Spanish folding and fighting knife, the navaja, which he could have picked up on his school trip through Europe, or simply could have purchased it in a East End shop. The film The Pride and the Passion, set in Spain and including Frank Sinatra and Cary Grant as the stars, shows two men fighting in combat with these fighting knives, these navajas. You can see from this very famous painting, and note the date, 1888, that they look quite vicious weapons, but they could easily fold. It's a 6-inch knife, fold to 6 inches within the handle, and it made this ominous click as it was opened out. Indeed, you could get a leather maker to simply make one for you on either side, if you're left-handed or right-handed, of a jackboot. James wasn't a doctor or a surgeon, so where could he gain anatomical knowledge of a woman? Well, his school tours at Eton every year to Europe would have included La Specola in Florence, where waxwork models of the human body were on open view. And if that was too far to go or less frequent for him, just down the road in Cambridge from his college, King's College, was the Anatomical Museum of Cambridge, where again models and real human bodies were on display. Why would you want to keep all this a secret? It's quite clear James was the killer. Why wasn't he arraigned, put on trial in court, and found guilty, but of course clearly insane? Well, at one end we have Victoria, who worried about instability at the heart of her empire, and we had Prince Edward, who was looking forward to becoming king and maintaining the status quo and not rocking this empire boat. Edward the Caresser, Edward Prince of Wales, had his own problems with image. He was a heavy smoker and drinker. He was obese, a gambler, a womanizer, went off with a number of men's wives, involved in a number of scandals. But the Queen was 70 years old at the time, and he was just itching to get the throne. Let me demonstrate to you the complete lack of a moral compass of this guy, Prince Edward. This is a siege d'amour. It's a love seat. It's kept in Paris, and it was in a Parisian brothel to allow the obese prince to make love to Parisian prostitutes on his frequent visits to the continent. It may be that Victoria was kept in ignorance of all of this, but I think that's unlikely. And so we have a queen and a prince, two princes, who are problematical and who are in danger of losing their titles. Why wouldn't they want to keep all of this confidential? Well, let's look at their motives. There were problems in Ireland, insurrections in the empire. They feared anarchy, mob violence, revolution even, and the dissolution of the monarchy. It had happened before. In England, a king had lost his head in the Civil War. So the first solution was to marry Eddie off to Mary of Teck. They were engaged in December 1891, but when that looked that it wasn't going to go the right way, Eddie died a month later in January 1892, supposedly of pneumonia or supposedly of Spanish flu. But let's think about this. It was very convenient. And we can now add the list of deaths to Dr. Stowles in 1970, who said he knew who the Ripper was and mentioned the surname beginning with S, which indeed James Stephen does. And then the Prince of the Realm, Eddie, Albert Victor, and here we have the Angel of Death coming to collect him, and the Ripper himself, because again James, 20 days after Eddie, supposedly died in an asylum alone of starvation. Here's James's shared tombstone in Kensal Green Cemetery in London. As you can see from the writing, shared with his mother and father, shared with two of his sisters, and a very young brother who died just less than a year old. And it says on his gravestone, also of James Kenneth Stephen, son of the same parents, sometime fellow of King's College, Cambridge. Not a lot for a man who has an incredible history. Both his brothers rose high in the legal fraternity and became indeed Knights of the Realm, Sir Harry Lushington Stephen and Sir Herbert Stephen, and both opted to be buried well away from their parents, their sisters, and indeed their brother James. And you can see from this tombstone of Sir Herbert Stephen, it's already been desecrated. Somebody before me knew the whole truth about this situation. The police at the time of the Ripper murders were mocked by the local people. They were said to be absolutely clueless and blind. But they weren't, not the ordinary copper on the street. It was their lords and masters who blindfolded them, who hoodwinked them, and who led them astray. And the reason that royalty were in fear of anarchy and revolution was that there were riots in February of 1886 in London because of the poverty and the situation amongst the poor. And then in November 1887, less than a year before the autumn of terror of 1888, armed and mounted police charged a crowd in Trafalgar Square. Revolution was in the air. Just sit back for a minute and imagine the reaction of the people, not only of the East End of London, but probably of the whole country, if they knew what aristocracy knew, if they knew what the Lords of Parliament knew, if they knew what the senior police knew about the Jack the Ripper murders and the real culprit. The end result of all of that could indeed have been the second civil war in England and the second time that the monarchy was brought down. So, bread and circuses for the mob. Mary of Teck married George, who became king after Edward did in 1901. And after all, for Mary, one prospective king is just as good as another. She had lost Eddie. She soon joined up with George. And what's another important part of this story is this. We have Edward with his brother Alfred and his son Eddie, dressed in the ceremonial garb of Freemasonry, of which Prince Edward was the Grand Master. I'd like you to now recall the book Pretty Jane and the Viper of Kidbrooke Lane, where it was Freemasonry that wiped the slate clean on another murder and got the murderer out of prison. James Kenneth Stephen, I can't prove was a Mason. He was kicked out of his gentleman's club, and I'm quite sure that if he was a Freemason, that would have been whitewashed many years ago. But it's difficult to believe at the highest level of the legal profession that his father James Fitzjames was, and his two brothers Herbert and Harry, that they were not Freemasons. This book, Letters from Hell, by Stuart P. Evans and Keith Skinner, details the hundreds of letters written from all over the country, supposedly by Jack the Ripper. What organisation could do this other than Freemasonry? And to keep it close in the family, as it were, probably only one Masonic lodge would have been used, since Sir Charles Warren, who was the Metropolitan Police Commissioner at the time of the Ripper murders and indeed resigned after the murder of Mary Kelly, the sixth victor, in 1886 he was Master of Masonic Lodge 2076, the Quatuor Coronati, which is now the Research Lodge of Freemasonry. So my guess is, if any particular lodge was used to spread this disinformation, it was this one. For the finale of this story, we need to go back to the bachelor's cottage at Sandringham in Norfolk, which is now called York House. Now another stunning revelation. 55 years ago in 1971, a woman, Mary Hallam, wrote to the UK Sunday Times newspaper. She stated that it was common knowledge amongst the legal fraternity at the time, which included a man called Patrick Bowes-Lyon, that James was Jack the Ripper. Now, Patrick Bowes-Lyon was the second tutor with James to Albert Victor at Bachelor's Cottage, now York House. And that information was very, very quickly suppressed. Why would that be? Well, it may have been that Patrick Bowes-Lyon was the great-uncle of the Queen Mother, who died in 2001. Whether she knew anything about this, of course, is lost in the mists of time. From the relationship that had been developed between James and Eddie, James sent both copies of his books to Buckingham Palace, and they are held in the Royal Collection. Whether we will ever find out any more about that relationship between James and Eddie is probably not a consideration, as the Royal Archives are outside of the Freedom of Information Act. Now, we do know for a fact that the Secret Service at the time, when in Cambridge, reported on the relationship between James and Eddie, and that had Eddie sent off into the army and well away from the orbit and the influence of James. But there are always questions. Did they conspire on the death of Montague John Druitt, who became the patsy, the red herring of all of them? Or did they at least hide the fact of the murder? And did they interfere with the coroner's court about his death? And what else might they have done to protect the crown? So we come back to the fine mind of the Roman senator Cicero. Cui bono? Who benefits? Well, certainly it protected the images of these four places: Eton College, King's Cambridge, Toynbee Hall, and the law courts in London. And there's another four: New Scotland Yard, where the police force were numbed and incapacitated by their senior management; MI5, or the Secret Service, who were definitely involved in the cover-up; the Houses of Parliament, where the Prime Minister got rid of the signature book which had Prince Albert Victor in it during the Cleveland Street scandal; and Buckingham Palace, who hid the relationship between Eddie and James. So there are a few places to mention: Eton College, Cambridge University, the Law Society, Freemasonry, Toynbee Hall, Scotland Yard, the Secret Service. And to those 8 we can of course also include the extended family of J.K. Stephen, 10 Downing Street, the Prime Minister's residence because of that hidden visitors book with the signature of Albert Victor, the royal family at that time, and of course anybody who's ever made any money selling books and articles about Jack the Ripper. Within the apostles themselves we can see Herbert and Harry on either side of Prince Albert Victor. They went on to become high in the legal profession and Knights of the Realm. Interestingly, this Apostles Club in Cambridge, which was essentially a club for gay guys, became a recruiting ground in the 1950s for Soviet spies. Guy Burgess, Donald MacLean, Anthony Blunt, John Cairncross and Kim Philby were all involved. Now, a cursory glance of the Prime Ministers of the United Kingdom will show that in those 140 odd years since the time of Jack the Ripper, there were 9 who came from Eton. You might recognise a few of them. None of these people, if they ever did know anything about the true story, would of course have opted to say that they went to the same school as a serial killer. So, for want of any better word for it, the whole of this cover-up, the whole of this whitewash of Jack the Ripper and his true identity, James Kenneth Stephen, was done by the establishment. History is history, but I do think again it's important to emphasise that the present royal family of 2026 and indeed Freemasonry are good-hearted and solid institutions. We have moved on tremendously since those dark days in Victorian and Edwardian times. I've no time to tell you now how I came to be a killer, but you should know, as time will show, that I'm society's pillar. Did he or did he not write that particular poem? So let's look again at Jack the Ripper, looking at the caricatures of him and work out the real faces. Here they are: James Kenneth Stephen as a schoolboy, as a student, as a scholar, a graduate, and a serial killer. Accept no substitutes. James or Jack Kenneth Stephen was Jack the Ripper. Now, another name for James, as in James Kenneth Stephen, is Jack. And if we look at his initials, JKS, add a couple of letters, then all the work was Jack's. So, let's talk about Sherlock again. How often have I said to you that when you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth? One does wonder in those days if Sherlock, finding out the truth, would have actually told it. I hope you can now take on board these words by Albert Einstein. Blind belief in authority is the greatest enemy of truth. If you found that story interesting, you may be interested also in two of my other stories, James I and Louis XIV, and the fact that these very two powerful and autocratic kings hid the truth from the populace. They're in History's Mysteries. All three of these stories, The Prisoner in the Iron Mask, The True Identity of Author and Playwright William Shakespeare, and The True Identity of Jack the Ripper, which is in fact 2 books, will be available soon. Just keep your eye on History's Mysteries. Finally, I'd like to quote Arthur Schopenhauer. All truth passes through 3 stages. First, it's ridiculed. Second, it's violently opposed, and I'm expecting that. And third, it's accepted as self-evident. This story about the true identity of Jack the Ripper is dedicated in memory of the 5 canonical victims: Annie Chapman, Mary Ann Nichols, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Kelly. And of course I must add to that victims number 1 and 7. Number 1, Martha Tabram, and number 7, Alice Mackenzie. Jack killed 7 in all. Let us also add in memoriam Montague John Druitt and Florence Chandler Maybrick, who were both victims in this sad and sorry story. And so, once and for all, in the nearly 150 years history of the true identity of Jack the Ripper, we can say finally, case closed. And if you're still not convinced about James Kenneth Stephen being the murderer, then I suggest you read it in his own words in part 3.